Have you been wanting to play punk guitar but don't know where to start? Well, 31 years ago when I first started playing guitar in a punk band, I was in the exact same spot. Unfortunately for me, I had to kind of figure it out on my own, and I made a lot of mistakes along the way. But in this video, I'll save you years of trial and error by showing you 5 techniques you need to know to get started playing punk rock guitar today. And these techniques aren't just great for punk, but they can transfer over to any type of rock style guitar playing. So if that sounds good to you, grab your guitar and let's go. All right, so the first technique we're going to talk about are power chords. The great thing about power chords is they are one of the easiest chords to play. They can be played a lot of different ways, but usually they're made up of the lower notes of a major bar chord. And specifically, they're made of the first note and the 5th note of the major scale. But don't worry, you don't need to know any scales to play a power chord. There's one way to put your fingers, and it works all the way up and down the fretboard on multiple strings. So the first power chord we're going to talk about is the 2-note power chord. And so to play a 2-note power chord, we're going to put our index finger on the root note. For this example, we're going to play an A, so the A is the 5th fret of the low E string, the bottom string. And then we're going to put our ring finger 2 frets down and the next string over on the 7th fret of the A string. And that's a 2-note power chord. And this chord can be moved up and down the neck. And since our scale goes through every note and repeats itself along the fretboard, that means if you can play one power chord, you can play any chord up and down the neck. And then we can also play them starting on the A string. So if we put our index finger at the 5th fret of the A string, the 2nd string down, that's a D. So when we also add our ring finger at the 7th fret of the D string, that's a D power chord. And we can move it up and down the neck too. And although it's not very common, we can also do that rooted on the D string. So if we have our first finger at the 5th fret of the D string and our ring finger at the 7th fret of the G string, you can also play a power chord there. And so 2-note power chords sound the most aggressive of all the power chords. They're usually used by bands like Black Sabbath, or hardcore bands. But they can also be used in a lot of different applications. And if you're enjoying this video, check out my beginner punk guitar course that's available on my website, scottobryanguitar.com. I cover all these topics plus more, just more in depth. And then the next type of power chord we have are the 3-note power chords. And 3-note power chords, like 2-note power chords, can be moved up and down the neck and played on multiple strings. So if we take our first example, our A 2-note power chord, and then we add a note at the 7th fret of the D string, we get a 3-note power chord. And so all we're doing here is we're doubling the A note. So the 5th fret of the low E string is an A, and then the 7th fret of the D string is also an A. So we're basically just repeating that note an octave up and thickening the chord up. And again, we can move this up and down the neck. And our root note is still an A, so this is still an A power chord. If we move it the next string over at the 5th fret, that's still a D power chord. It's just a 3-note version, and we can move it up and down the neck. The only difference with the 3-note power chord is you can't move that power chord in the same form up to the root on the D string, because due to the tuning of the guitar, you're going to get one off note on the B string, which gives it that kind of weird sound. And so 3-note power chords sound a little bit thicker, but also a little less aggressive. And they're ubiquitous in punk rock and rock and roll. The next technique we're going to talk about is strumming. So there's a few different types of strummings that are used primarily in punk rock as well as a lot of other rock music, with the first being the exclusive use of downstrokes. Now this type of attack is very aggressive. It tends to be a little choppier, and it's used by a lot of the earlier punk bands like the Ramones and Black Flag. So if we take, for example, Blitzkrieg Bop by the Ramones, on this song as well as a lot of other Ramones songs, Johnny Ramone uses only downstrokes. And so he plays the rhythm something like this. So as we can see, the way he plays it is a lot more difficult than if you used alternate strumming. If you used alternate strumming, you can play a lot faster, but he chose to play it this way because it's a lot more aggressive and it gives it a little bit more of a frantic feel. So here's an example with all downstrokes. Now let's hear it with alternate strumming. So you can hear it's definitely a little bit more aggressive, it's a little bit more frantic, it's a little choppier using just the downstrokes. Another good example is Nervous Breakdown by Black Flag. Again, it's very choppy, it's very aggressive. We hear it with alternate strumming. Not only is it less aggressive, but the rhythm's a little different. It definitely changes the song. And so then for faster or more complicated riffs, we can use alternate strumming. And alternate strumming is just what it sounds like. It's using up and down strumming. And while alternate strumming usually sounds a little bit less aggressive, it can also sound pretty frantic and aggressive depending on how you play it. So a good example of this is the Adolescents' I Hate Children. So again, we've got kind of a frantic, aggressive riff, but it'd be really difficult to play that with all downstrokes. So we can get the speed by using the alternate strumming. The next technique that we're going to talk about is the use of octaves. Basically what an octave is it's two of the same notes an octave apart. So we basically have a low version of the note and a high version of the note played at the same time. So if we take an A octave, for example, we have an A note at the 5th fret of the low E string. And then we also have an A note at the 7th fret of the D string. And if we play them together, it sounds like this. So it kind of has a very cutting, unique sound. And what's cool about octaves is the form of them is very similar to the form of a power chord. So for a power chord, we have our root note, and then we have our second note is 2 frets down on the next string over. For our octave, we have our second note 2 frets down, 2 strings over. And so we can play octaves up and down the neck on the low E string. We can also play them on the A string in the same form. And the trick with octaves is that you only want to play the 2 notes that you want to play without hitting that string that's in between. And so in order to accomplish this, we're going to mute that in-between string with the pad of our index finger and play the other 2 notes. So we play the root note, bridge our index finger over, and mute that second string with the underside of our index finger. And then we're going to fret the next string 2 frets down. And then we can strum all 3 strings, and that middle string's not going to ring out. So you can get that octave sound. And we do the same thing if the note is rooted on the A string. So for example, that's a D octave. And so a good example of using octaves in punk music is the Adolescent song Amoeba, but there's a ton of bands that use them. So the Adolescents use it a couple different ways in their song Amoeba. The first is to just play the same octaves over the chords that they're playing. So the chord progression in the beginning goes like this. And then over the top, the lead guitar is going to play the octave version of those chords. So it's in the exact same position, we're just playing octaves this time. And so that's one way you can use octaves. You can just substitute them for the chords that you're normally playing. And another way to play octaves is to use them as a harmonic method over the top of a chord progression. So for example, in that same song, when we get to the first guitar solo, there's an octave progression that is part of the solo. And so basically to do that is you can just develop a melody either using your ear or using a scale and play it over the chords using octaves. It's very similar to writing a single note melody lead, except we're using octaves this time. The next technique we're going to talk about are kind of transitionary things like pick slides and dive bombs. And so while you can use these techniques anywhere, they're typically used in either solos or like transitionary parts of a song. So for example, if we're going from like a verse where we're kind of subdued and we're going into a chorus where we're going to kind of get louder or have more impact, we can use like a pick slide. So let's say we're playing like a palm muted verse part. And then you're going to hit the chorus hard. You can do something like that. And so for pick slides, there's a lot of different ways you can do them. I like to take my pick and kind of angle it so that we're scraping against the coils. And we can play just the bottom string. We can play the bottom 2 strings. We can even try and get the bottom 3 strings. Really just kind of experiment with it. But that's one way to do it. Just kind of angle your pick and scrape it along the coils. And you can go the other way. You can also try doing it just flat. You can try wiggling it a little bit and get a kind of effect. There's really a lot of different ways you can do it. I really like doing it as like a fast slide into like a chorus or out of a chorus. And then another technique that's very similar is the dive bomb. And all a dive bomb is something Johnny Thunders does a lot, is we're just gonna play a note like high up on the fretboard on the low E string. And then we're just gonna slide our finger down. And a lot of times this can be done like in the middle of a solo or again as a transitionary part. So if you're playing like a big opening chord. And again, you can also slide up. Johnny Thunders does that a lot. So again, another thing to experiment with. We can also combine our dive bombs with like alternate picking or like tremolo style picking. So we're gonna start at a higher fret and then we're just gonna alternate pick very quickly and then slide our finger down as we go. And then we can end with like a chord or something. So again, there's no right or wrong way to do it. Experiment with what sounds good to you. It's just something to kind of break up the monotony of just playing chords in a rhythm and add a little extra interest to it. So the last technique we're going to talk about is more of a lead guitar technique, but it's pretty straightforward and I can show you how to use it in pretty much any situation. And so that's double stop bends, or what I like to call Chuck Berry bends. So the Chuck Berry bend sounds like this. And so basically we're taking a unison bend, and a unison bend is basically bending up a lower string so that it matches the note of the higher string. And so a common way to do this is to play our first finger, so let's say on the 3rd fret of the B string, and then we're gonna go to 2 frets up on the next string over the G string, and we're gonna play that 5th fret, and we're gonna bend the 5th fret up until it matches the 3rd fret. So we're gonna play both notes at the same time and bend the bottom one up so that it matches the 3rd. And that's a unison bend. And so for a double stop bend, all we're doing is we're adding another note. We're adding the 3rd fret at the high E string. So we're gonna bridge our index finger across the 3rd fret of the B and E string. And then we're gonna do that same bend on the 5th fret of the G string. But most of the time we're not playing it at the same time. We're going to go back and forth between the 2 high notes to the bend. So we can play it 1-to-1, or we can play like 2 of the higher notes and 1 of the bend. Or any kind of combination. And the cool thing about this technique is you can use it similar to the way we use the octaves. So you could play the corresponding double stop bend over the corresponding chord. So let's say our index fingers bridge across the 3rd fret of the B and E string. That's gonna be a double stop bend for a G chord. And a G power chord is played at the 3rd fret of the low E, like that. So 3rd fret low E is our power chord, 3rd fret high E and B string is our root for our double stop bend. So it's really easy to remember because we can do this all the way up and down the fretboard. So if we're playing a chord rooted at the 5th fret of the low E, we can play the double stop bend at the 5th fret of the high E and B. 7th fret, 7th fret. And so we never have to worry about being out of key if we play it this way. And so when we get to the A string, things get a little bit more complicated, but not much. So if we have a chord progression that starts on the 3rd fret of the A string, that's a C chord. It's also the same as the 8th fret of the low E. So basically our double stop bend is gonna be at the 8th fret of the high E. And then if we go to a D, the D is at the 10th fret of the low E, same chord. So we can play the double stop bend at the 10th fret of the high E. And so a good example of this is Personality Crisis by the New York Dolls, which goes like this. And then Johnny Thunders is gonna play the double stop bends over the top of that chord progression. So we've got a C. So he plays at the 8th fret of the high E, because the C is at the 8th fret of the low E. And then it moves up to a D. So he plays the 10th fret of the high E, because that's a D. And then it goes down to the 3rd fret of the low E, which is a G. So we have the option of playing it down here at the 3rd fret of the high E. But Johnny Thunders actually plays it at the other G that's on the high E, which is the 15th fret. So we have the chord progression. And then we have the double stop bends. So the trick with playing the double stop bends in a chord progression that's rooted on the A string is to, one, either figure out the chord. So if you know this is a C, then you can find your C on the high E. And if you don't know your notes too well along the neck, you can figure out where this chord is on the low E, and then that corresponds to where you're going to play it on the high E. So that's it for this one. I hope you liked the lesson. If you appreciate this content, please like and subscribe. It helps me to figure out what kind of content you guys like and keeps the channel going. And also remember to check out my beginner punk guitar course on my website, scottobryanguitar.com. It covers everything we talked about today, more in depth, plus a lot of other topics. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.